The ground was shaking, not from an earthquake, not from distant thunder, from hooves. 4,000 pounds of prehistoric muscle, horn, and fury, closing the gap at 30 miles per hour across the red dust of the African bush. And there was one woman between that animal and the tree line. One woman, her running shoes, and every decision she would make in the next 90 seconds. If you want to understand what it actually takes to survive a moment like that, stay right here. Because this story is not just about running. It is about reading the land, reading the animal, and reading yourself under the kind of pressure that strips everything else away. If you are new here, hit subscribe now, because we cover stories exactly like this one. The moments where everything humans know about movement, instinct, and survival gets tested in the most unforgiving classrooms on Earth. Her name is Mara Holt. She was 34 years old when it happened. A trail runner from Johannesburg with 11 years of competitive experience behind her, a woman who had finished ultramarathons across 4 continents and who had always treated the African wilderness with the deep, personal respect of someone who grew up near its edges. She was not reckless. She was not careless. She was exactly the kind of person who does everything right and still ends up in the path of something that can end her. The reserve she was running in that morning sits in a semi-arid stretch of the Eastern Cape, a place of flat-topped acacia, red laterite soil, and the particular quality of silence that Africa has early in the morning, when the heat has not yet arrived and everything living seems to be holding its breath. It is one of the few reserves in southern Africa where the black rhinoceros has been successfully reintroduced, a conservation triumph built on years of careful work, anti-poaching operations, and the quiet patience of rangers who know these animals the way you know a difficult neighbor. Present, unpredictable. Best observed from a respectful distance. Mara had run this trail network many times before. The reserve offered guided running safaris, a growing movement in wildlife tourism that puts humans back into the landscape, not in a vehicle, but on their own 2 feet, at the speed evolution intended. You see the world differently at running pace. You smell things you miss from inside a Land Rover. You hear the ground. You develop a relationship with distance that no engine can give you. And Mara loved it for exactly those reasons. She understood what this kind of running meant. It was not performance, it was participation. That morning she had set out at first light with a loose plan to cover about 18 kilometers along the southern loop, a route that curved around a seasonal waterhole, climbed a low rocky ridge with views across the valley, and came back through a section of dense bush where the undergrowth closed in on both sides, and the trail felt almost like a tunnel through the vegetation. She carried water. She carried her phone. She carried a small canister of bear spray, not because bears were any kind of concern, but because some wildlife guides had started recommending pepper-based deterrents for general wildlife encounters, and she had picked up the habit years earlier in the Canadian Rockies and never quite dropped it. She was about 9 kilometers in when she saw it, or rather, when she felt the change in the air first. Experienced runners in wilderness environments will tell you this. There is a particular quality to the silence that descends when a large animal freezes nearby. The birds stop. The insects recalibrate. The whole acoustic texture of the bush shifts in a way that is almost impossible to describe, but unmistakable once you have felt it. Mara felt it. She slowed her pace immediately. Her heart rate did not need the monitor on her wrist to know it had shifted gear. She came around a slight bend in the trail and saw the black rhinoceros not 30 meters ahead of her on the path, a mature female, head low, one ear rotating slowly in her direction. The animal weighed somewhere between 800 and 1,000 kilograms. Her 2 horns were intact, the front one nearly half a meter long, the second shorter, both the color of old bone. She was standing in the middle of the trail with the particular quality of stillness that large animals have when they are deciding something. The black rhinoceros is not like its white cousin. Where the white rhino tends toward a kind of wary passivity, the black rhino has a reputation built over centuries of genuine data. It is one of the most aggressive large mammals on Earth. It is also one of the most critically endangered, which means that the animals alive today carry the survivor genetics of a species that has been hunted almost to extinction. And those genetics are not mild. They are the genetics of animals that fought and ran and charged and survived. The female on that trail had no context for a human moving toward her at pace. She had not been habituated to runners in the way that some reserve animals become habituated to vehicles. To her, Mara was an unidentified animal appearing suddenly from downwind, moving at a speed associated with predators, at a distance that left almost no margin. She charged. There was no warning posture of the kind that wildlife documentaries love to describe, no extended pause, no dramatic pawing of the ground. She charged in the way that black rhinos charge when they have already made the decision, which is to say, with total commitment and terrifying speed. That compacted body, built like a siege engine over 40 million years of evolutionary refinement, accelerating from a standstill to 30 kilometers per hour in a space that seemed to swallow the distance between them before Mara had time to fully process that it was happening. What she did in that moment is worth examining very carefully, because every decision she made was right, and the decisions were not random. They came from a deep and layered understanding of how to move through wild space, what running in wilderness actually demands, and what happens to the human nervous system when it confronts genuine mortal threat. The first thing she did was turn, not away from the animal in a direct straight-line retreat along the trail, but at an angle. She broke off the trail to the left, into the scrub, at roughly 45 degrees from the direction of the charge. This single decision was more important than almost anything else she did in the minutes that followed. Black rhinos charge in the direction of the stimulus. They lock onto a target, and they accelerate toward the last known position of that target. Their eyesight is genuinely poor. They experience the world primarily through smell and hearing. What this means in practice is that an animal charging at full speed in a straight line through dense bush is not dynamically adjusting its trajectory in real time, the way a lion or a leopard might. It is following a locked heading. Breaking the straight line, particularly into cover where the scent and sound signature gets disrupted by vegetation, is the single most effective immediate response available. She did not know this as a memorized fact retrieved from a textbook. She knew it the way a skilled trail runner knows the surface of a trail, through accumulated experience, through conversations with guides, through the kind of osmotic learning that happens when you spend enough years moving through environments where the wildlife is real and the stakes are genuine. She had spoken with rangers about rhino behavior on multiple previous visits to the reserve. She had read, she had listened, and in the half-second when the rhino moved, her body acted on everything it knew. The second thing she did was accelerate. This sounds obvious. Run faster. But the specifics matter enormously. She was running through broken scrub in the semi-darkness of early morning, through vegetation that pulled at her legs, and over ground that offered no guarantees of stability. She accelerated anyway, and she did it without slowing to look back. This is harder than it sounds. The human reflex in the face of a charging animal is to look at the animal, to track the threat visually, to keep eyes on the thing that might kill you. That reflex is understandable, and it is also dangerous, because looking back costs stride efficiency, costs balance, costs the fraction of a second that in this context can be the only margin available. She heard the rhino. She heard the impact of those hooves on the red soil, the crashing of the undergrowth as the animal came through the bush after her initial break from the trail. She heard it, and she kept her eyes forward, and she ran. The third thing she did was use the landscape. This is where 11 years of trail running saved her life more directly than any piece of equipment or any memorized protocol. Trail runners develop a relationship with terrain that road runners simply do not have. You read the ground ahead of you. You read it constantly, unconsciously, the way a fluent reader moves through text without consciously decoding each letter. You see the rocky section, and your stride adjusts before your conscious mind has finished processing the input. You see the root, the loose stone, the soft patch of sand where your foot might slip, and your body responds with a fluency that comes only from thousands of hours of exactly this kind of movement. Mara moved through that scrub the way she moved through any difficult trail, reading it, using it. She angled toward a section of denser vegetation where a cluster of large rocks broke through the soil surface, a small rocky outcrop perhaps 3 meters across, with boulders about waist height. She cleared one of these rocks with a stride and a push that put the solid stone mass between her and the direction of the charge. Black rhinos do not negotiate obstacles the way humans do. That rock formation was a genuine barrier. The rhino crashed through the outer scrub, missed the line of the angled retreat, and kept going for several strides before decelerating. This is the other thing about black rhino charges that the guides always emphasize. Many charges are what is called a bluff charge, a warning. Even genuine charges can be discontinued if the stimulus disappears from the animal's perceptual field. The point is not that the rhino stops being dangerous. It is that the charge itself is not an infinite commitment. If the animal cannot locate the threat, if the scent breaks up, if the sound of movement stops or changes direction unexpectedly, the charge can resolve into a stop, a turn, a confused reassessment. Mara crouched behind the rock formation, controlling her breathing with the discipline of a competitive athlete. This is the part of the story that does not get enough attention, the physiological discipline. When a human being is flooded with adrenaline at the level produced by genuine mortal threat, the instinct to keep running, to keep moving, to not stop, is overwhelming. The body is screaming at you. Legs moving is survival. Stopping is death. The cascade of hormones does not distinguish between sensible cover and continued flight. It just wants movement. She stopped. She crouched. She controlled her breathing. She made herself small and still behind that rock while the rhino circled in the middle distance. Still agitated, still moving, but no longer in a locked charge. The adrenaline was enormous. She described it later as feeling like the inside of her chest had been replaced with something that was vibrating at a frequency she could feel in her teeth. But she held still, and the rhino, unable to locate the source of the disturbance, gradually moved away through the scrub, back toward the waterhole to the east. She waited. Not for 30 seconds. Not for a minute. She waited, crouched behind that rock, for 11 minutes by the timer on her watch. She waited until she could no longer hear the rhino moving. She waited until the birds came back. That was her signal, the return of the birds, the acoustic texture of the bush restoring itself to its normal morning quality. When the birds came back, she moved. She did not run back along the trail. She moved through the scrub in a wide arc, keeping the rocks and vegetation between herself and the direction the rhino had gone, working toward the ridge trail which she knew from her route map would bring her back to the reserve's main road from above, without crossing the lower valley where the rhino was moving. It took her nearly 2 hours to cover a distance she could have run in 25 minutes under normal conditions. She arrived back at the main lodge dehydrated, scratched from the scrub and completely intact. Now, let us sit with what happened here. Because there is a version of this story that gets told as a miraculous escape, a tale of luck and adrenaline, a woman who survived because the rhino missed. That version is wrong. The version that is true is harder to tell and more interesting. Mara survived because she was prepared for exactly the kind of environment she was moving through. She survived because she had done the work, not just the physical work of building the fitness and the trail skills, but the intellectual and experiential work of understanding the wildlife that shares the landscape she had chosen to run in. Black rhinoceros behavior has been studied intensively for decades, partly because conservation efforts have brought the species back from the very edge of extinction, and partly because understanding behavior is essential to managing the small, scattered populations that still survive. The total wild population is somewhere around 5,000 individuals. 5,000. For a species that was once distributed across sub-Saharan Africa in numbers we cannot accurately estimate but can reasonably describe as enormous, 5,000 is almost nothing. Each of those animals is irreplaceable in a very real sense. The gene pool is narrow, the populations are fragmented, the pressures on their survival are relentless. What makes the black rhino particularly vulnerable is the same thing that makes it so dangerous in close encounters. It is a specialist, a browser, not a grazer, equipped with a hooked prehensile upper lip that lets it strip leaves from branches and navigate dense thorn bush with an efficiency that seems improbable for an animal of that bulk. It evolved in complex, dense bush environments where visibility is poor, where predators use cover, where the difference between survival and death is often the speed and completeness of the threat response. That hair-trigger aggression is not a personality flaw. It is a survival trait refined across millions of years in an environment where hesitation is fatal. The tragedy of the rhinoceros, and this word is not too large, is that the very trait that helps it survive against leopards and hyenas and lions makes it almost impossible to protect against the threat that is actually destroying it. Poaching. Organized, well-resourced, heavily armed commercial poaching for the horn trade, which feeds a demand primarily in parts of Asia where rhino horn is used in traditional medicine and as a status object, commands prices that rival cocaine by weight. The horn is keratin. It is the same material as your fingernails. The scientific literature contains not a single credible study demonstrating any medical efficacy for any of the conditions for which it is prescribed. It is fingernail. And to obtain it, poachers kill an animal whose entire species is hanging on by a thread. The reserves where black rhinos are maintained today are fortresses. Rangers carry weapons. Anti-poaching units operate with military tactics and military discipline. Aerial surveillance, camera networks, informant systems, all of it deployed to protect animals whose value alive. To ecosystems, to tourism, to the simple irreplaceable fact of their existence on Earth, is incalculable. A single black rhino can generate tens of thousands of dollars annually in wildlife tourism revenue for the reserve in which it lives. The living animal is worth more. The same calculus that applies to the sharks of Fiji's coral reefs applies here, in the red dust of the Eastern Cape. The animal alive, moving through its ecosystem, being glimpsed by a trail runner at first light, is worth infinitely more than anything that can be extracted from its dead body. Mara understood this. She has spoken about it in interviews since the incident, and what she says is revealing. She describes the encounter not with the language of trauma, though the physiological reality of what she experienced was absolutely traumatic, but with something closer to gratitude and awe. That animal, she said, was doing exactly what it was built to do. It was defending itself. It was responding appropriately to an intrusion. The failure of communication was not the rhino's failure. The responsibility for safe navigation of that space was hers. This is the kind of thinking that separates the runners who survive close wildlife encounters from the ones who do not. Not technical knowledge alone, though that matters enormously. Not physical capability alone, though that matters too. It is the foundational orientation toward the wild space, the recognition that when you choose to run in an environment that contains large and dangerous animals, you are the visitor. The landscape is not a trail race course that happens to have some interesting wildlife in the background. It is a functioning ecosystem in which multiple species are navigating their survival simultaneously, and your presence is one variable in a complex equation that none of the other species have been asked about. Trail running in wilderness is growing. The numbers are significant. What was once a small community of hardcore ultra-runners willing to put up with logistics and discomfort to experience landscape in its most direct form has become a global movement. Races now take place in national parks and wildlife reserves across Africa, Asia, South America. Guided running safaris have expanded in southern and East Africa. People are running routes through the Himalayas, across the Mongolian steppe, along the migration corridors of East Africa. The encounter with wild space is part of the appeal. The aliveness of it, the unpredictability. And with that growth comes a responsibility to understand the environments in question at a level that goes beyond looking up a list of things not to do. The guides at the reserve, where Mara was running, describe a spectrum of preparedness that they see in visitors. At one end, there are people who have never thought seriously about wildlife encounters, who carry the suburban assumption that dangerous animals are things that happen to other people in other places, and that the reserve is essentially a large outdoor television show with themselves as the audience. These are the people who make dangerous decisions, not from malice, but from a failure of imagination. At the other end of the spectrum are people like Mara, who have done the work, who understand the animals, who have thought through scenarios, who have the physical skills to execute under pressure. The difference between these two kinds of runner is not bravery, it is preparation, which is, when you strip away all the drama and the adrenaline and the close call, the actual lesson of what happened on that trail. Let us go deeper into the specific skills that preparation produces, the angle of retreat. Mara's break from the trail at 45 degrees was not random. It was informed by a working knowledge of how large herbivores in charge pursue a target. Elephants, rhinos, hippos, Cape buffalo. Each has different characteristics but a shared tendency, when charging in response to a sudden threat, to continue in the direction of the initial stimulus, particularly in dense cover, where tracking a moving target through vegetation is genuinely difficult. Breaking the straight line disrupts the predicting geometry of the charge. Moving into cover disrupts the scent trail. Changing speed, dropping suddenly or accelerating through a gap in the vegetation, disrupts the sound signature. None of this is a guarantee. None of it transforms a dangerous situation into a safe one, but it changes the odds in ways that matter enormously at the margins. And in wildlife encounters, the margins are everything. The use of cover is the second major skill. Trail runners who operate in wilderness environments tend to develop a very different relationship to the terrain features around them compared to trail runners who operate primarily in mountain or desert environments where wildlife is either absent or more predictable. In the bush, every rocky outcrop, Every dense thicket, every termite mound large enough to break a sight line is a potential asset in the context of a wildlife encounter. The trail runner's habitual reading of terrain for footing and navigation expands, when properly educated, into a reading of terrain for cover and concealment. This is not paranoia. It is the same ecological awareness that every species in that landscape exercises continuously. The impala scans the terrain around the waterhole, not anxiously, but fluidly, as a continuous background process. The kudu pauses at every gap in the cover before moving through. Every herbivore in the African bush maintains a map of available cover in its immediate environment at all times. The trail runner who develops this same awareness is simply operating at the same level of ecological sophistication as the animals it shares the space with. It is not a diminishment of the running experience. It is an enrichment. You run differently when the world is fully real around you. The management of the stop. Mara's decision to stop behind the rock formation and remain still for 11 minutes is arguably the most technically demanding element of the entire encounter. Not because it required physical skill, but because it required overriding deeply instilled physiological responses with hard-won cognitive discipline. The adrenaline spike associated with genuine fear of death is one of the most powerful states the human nervous system can produce. It is designed to produce action, movement, escape, telling a body in that state to stop, to be still, to be quiet, to breathe slowly and quietly when every cell is screaming otherwise, requires practice. The kind of practice that trail runners in wilderness environments can cultivate through specific preparation, breathing protocols, scenario visualization, practiced responses to adrenaline in the controlled context of very hard running intervals, where the physiological state is different, but the challenge of overriding the body's noise with conscious choice is similar. The runners who fare best in close wildlife encounters tend to be the runners whose relationship with their own physiology is most developed. Not the fastest, not the most experienced in terms of distance, the ones who know themselves best under pressure. There is a guide at the reserve, a man named Thomas, who has worked there for 19 years, who talks about this in terms that are worth examining carefully. He describes the qualities he looks for in a guest before he takes them on a walking or running safari, and the physical fitness of the person ranks quite far down his list. What he looks for first is how the person responds to unexpected events. Not dramatic ones, small ones, a vehicle that does not start, a change in the planned route due to animal movement in the area, lunch that arrives late. How does the person respond? With rigidity? With irritability? With the kind of entitled expectation that the world will perform according to plan? Or with flexibility? With interest? With the capacity to adapt without drama to change circumstances? Because that adaptive flexibility, that ease with uncertainty, that capacity to stay functional when the script changes, is exactly what gets you through a wildlife encounter safely. The ability to respond to what is actually in front of you, rather than what you expected to find. Thomas has seen runners with elite-level fitness make dangerous decisions in the field because their thinking was rigid, and he has seen runners of very modest physical ability navigate complex wildlife situations safely because their situational awareness and adaptive capacity were excellent. This points to something important about what trail running in wilderness environments actually develops in a person when approached seriously. It is not just aerobic capacity and strong ankles. It is a quality of attention. A mode of being present in the environment at a level that daily life in cities has largely trained out of most humans. The ability to read a landscape, to interpret sound and smell, and the behavior of other species as information. To maintain spatial awareness, not just of the trail surface, but of everything within the radius of your senses. To be genuinely, functionally, practically present in the physical world in a way that your survival, even in the softer sense of the word, genuinely depends upon. The rewilding of human perception. Some researchers have described this as exactly that. The return, through sustained exposure to genuinely wild environments, of a perceptual and attentional sophistication that modern humans have largely let atrophy because they no longer need it to survive. We evolved in landscapes like the one Mara was running through that morning. The human nervous system was shaped in those landscapes by exactly the kinds of pressures she experienced behind that rock. The acute hearing, the spatial memory, the ability to read animal behavior from very small cues. These are not exotic skills that belong only to indigenous trackers or wildlife professionals. They are the birthright of every human being, waiting to be reclaimed. Trail runners who regularly move through wildlife environments report changes in their perception that go beyond the duration of the run itself. A heightened attention to ambient sound in daily life, a greater ease with uncertainty and unplanned events, a quality of presence in physical space that feels both ancient and acutely contemporary, as if by returning, even briefly, to the landscape conditions under which the human sensory system was formed, something recalibrates. The reserve where Mara's encounter occurred has, since the incident, expanded its pre-run briefing for guests. Thomas leads these briefings himself. They take about 45 minutes, and they cover the specific animals likely to be encountered on the trail network, their individual behavioral profiles, the particular zones of the reserve where encounters are most probable at different times of day and season, and a detailed set of response protocols for each species. Not a list of rules, which Thomas does not favor, but a framework of understanding from which appropriate responses in novel situations can be derived. He uses a phrase that has stayed with the guides and the guests who hear it. He says, "The bush does not forgive ignorance, but it rewards attention." He says it plainly, without drama, in the same even tone in which he describes everything. And the guests who have run with him longest will tell you that this simple formulation, "the bush rewards attention," becomes a kind of organizing principle for their experience of running in wild space. Mara's encounter with the black rhino was not, in Thomas's assessment, a failure of the reserve's management or of the safari running program. It was an encounter of the kind that is always possible when humans move through environments that contain large and powerful wild animals. The reserve does not, and Thomas does not, promise that encounters will not happen. They promise that the encounters will be handled by people who are as prepared as it is possible to be. What Mara demonstrated was that the preparation worked. That a person who has done the physical, intellectual, and experiential preparation can move through a landscape that contains a charging black rhino and emerge intact. Not through luck, though there are always elements of luck in any encounter with a large wild animal, through skill. The black rhinoceros that charged Mara was subsequently monitored by the reserve's field team and found to be healthy and undisturbed, in the sense that the encounter had not produced any lasting behavioral change in the animal. She returned to her normal movement patterns within hours. The reserve noted her location for the following weeks and rerouted one of the trail sections to give her a wider range without human intrusion, while she was using her preferred territory near the waterhole. This is the other half of the conservation equation. The running program adapts to the animals, not the animals to the program. There is a broader context here that is worth drawing out explicitly. The black rhinoceros's recovery from the edge of extinction to a population of around 5,000 individuals is one of the significant conservation achievements of the last 40 years. It has been built on a combination of intensive anti-poaching work, habitat protection, careful genetic management of the small and fragmented populations that survive, and the development of economic models that make the living animal valuable to the communities and landowners who share the landscape with it. Wildlife tourism is central to this economic model in a way that cannot be overstated. When a reserve like the one Mara runs in can generate meaningful revenue from running safaris, that revenue supports the rangers, the anti-poaching patrols, the veterinary care, the fence maintenance, the entire infrastructure of protection that keeps these animals alive. The runner who pays to experience that landscape in this intimate, embodied, genuinely risky way is not consuming the wildlife. They are contributing to the conditions that allow the wildlife to exist. This is not a small thing. The numbers behind it are significant. A single well-managed black rhino can contribute over $100,000 annually to a reserve's conservation budget through tourism alone, across its lifetime. Multiply that across the 5,000 animals in the current wild population, and you begin to see the scale of the economic argument for protection. And that argument only holds if the animals are alive, and in landscapes that are worth visiting. The moment the economic model of extraction, of poaching, of selling the horn, becomes more viable than the economic model of protection, the animal is in danger. The trail runner, the safari guest, the wildlife photographer, the researcher spending months in the field, they are all part of the machinery that keeps the protection model viable. This is why what Mara did matters beyond her own survival. She did not panic. She did not scream. She did not injure the animal. She did not create the kind of incident that generates legal liability and bad press, and the closure of running programs in wildlife areas. She navigated the encounter with skill and respect, and emerged with her experience of that landscape, deepened rather than poisoned by fear. She has run in that reserve 6 times since the encounter. She runs it differently now, she says, more slowly, in some stretches, with more attention, with a quality of presence that she describes as closer to what running was meant to be all along. Not performance, not metrics, not the data on her watch, just a human being, moving through a living landscape, paying attention to everything. Let us talk about the preparation in practical terms, because the experiential and philosophical dimension of this is only meaningful if it is grounded in what can actually be done before you lace up your shoes and step onto a trail in a landscape that contains dangerous wildlife. Know the species. Not from a general wildlife book read once on a plane, but in genuine depth. Know the individual behavioral differences within species. The difference between a black and white rhino in charge response. The difference between a lone elephant and a cow with a calf. The particular danger profile of a Cape buffalo when encountered on a narrow trail in dense bush. The way a hippo on land, away from water, behaves differently from a hippo in water when approached too closely. Know how the behavior changes by time of day, by season, by weather. Know the patterns of animal movement in the specific landscape you are running in. Where do the animals go at dawn? Where do they drink at midday? Where do they move at dusk? These patterns are not mysterious, they are knowable. The guides know them. Ask. Talk to the guides at length. This is perhaps the single most high-value preparatory activity available to a runner, preparing for a wildlife safari. The knowledge held by experienced guides who have worked a specific landscape for years is irreplaceable and is often generously shared with anyone who demonstrates genuine interest. Thomas can tell you which section of the Southern Loop Trail at his reserve tends to concentrate rhino activity in the early dry season. He can tell you the wind directions that matter, which way the animals are likely to be facing when you come around a particular bend, which sections of the trail have good sight lines, and which compress into dangerous corners. This information is not in any guidebook. It lives in Thomas. Carry the appropriate tools and know how to use them. A pepper spray deterrent is not a magic shield. It has a limited effective range, requires the wind to cooperate, and demands a level of composure under pressure that is not guaranteed. But it is better than nothing, and carries a deterrent effect in some species at close range. More importantly, carry communication. A working phone or satellite communicator that allows you to contact the Reserve Operations Center if you need to stop your run and wait for assistance. Know the communication protocol before you run. Know the frequency if you carry a radio. Know the GPS coordinates of the main access points if your device has that capability. Run with a guide whenever possible. The loss of spontaneity and solitude is real, and some runners find it significant enough to be a genuine sacrifice. But a guide who knows the landscape is not just a safety asset, they are an educational resource of the highest order. Every run with Thomas produces knowledge that changes how you run the landscape the next time you are there alone. The knowledge compounds. After enough runs with an experienced guide, your solo running becomes genuinely safer because your reading of the landscape has become genuinely more sophisticated. Tell someone your route, every time. Leave a detailed description of your planned route, your estimated time of return, and what to do if you have not reported in by a specified time. This is not a complicated protocol. It takes 2 minutes, and it has saved lives. The physical preparation matters too, in ways that go beyond the obvious. Fitness level affects the options available to you in an emergency. A runner with a strong anaerobic capacity can accelerate explosively out of a surprise encounter. A runner with good proprioception and trail skills can maintain pace through difficult terrain under pressure. A runner who is trained in low-light conditions and can read terrain quickly at dawn or dusk has a genuine skill advantage in the specific time windows when wildlife encounters in bush environments are most likely. Practice running in technical terrain, not just the smooth, well-maintained single track of your local forest trails. Get comfortable in the broken, unpredictable stuff. Rocky ground, loose soil, scrub, the sections of bush where you cannot see your next footfall clearly until you are almost on it. Because that is the terrain that matters in an encounter. The smooth trail is irrelevant. What matters is what you can do when you break off the trail and into the actual bush. And practice the stop. Practice the deliberate deceleration from full sprint to stillness and silence. It sounds trivial. It is not. Do it in your training, in ordinary settings with nothing at stake. Sprint hard for 30 seconds, then freeze. Not slow down. Stop. Control the breathing from that state. Get familiar with the flood of sensation that the adrenaline of hard running produces and practice not acting on it. The discipline of the stop behind a rock while a black rhino circles in the middle distance is a trainable skill. It requires practice in conditions that do not involve a black rhino. The final thing worth saying about Mara's encounter is something she said herself, months afterward, in the context of a conversation about why she continued to run in the African bush after what had happened. She said that the experience had not made the landscape more frightening to her. It had made it more honest. The risk had always been real. The encounter had not created the risk. It had simply revealed it. And the revelation of real risk, she said, was not something she wanted to run from in the metaphorical sense. It was something she wanted to understand more deeply. This is the orientation that trail running in wild space cultivates at its best, not the elimination of risk through protocols and equipment and preparation, though all of those things matter, but the honest acknowledgement of risk as a feature of genuine engagement with a living world. A world in which you are not the most powerful thing present, a world in which your survival is not guaranteed by your technology, or your wealth, or your fitness level, but by your attention, your preparation, and your capacity to respond appropriately to what is actually in front of you. The black rhinoceros charged and did not connect. Mara moved at an angle and used the terrain and held still behind a rock, and listened to the birds and waited, and moved carefully back through the scrub and arrived at the lodge intact. What she did right was not any single thing. It was the accumulation of everything, the years of trail experience, the conversations with guides, the reading and learning and listening, the physical preparation, the conscious cultivation of the capacity to manage herself under pressure. It was, in the final analysis, the fullness of her